I talk to myself, or otherwise I can't remember how to do it. Okay, we are doing parables today. And just to remember the four things that we're looking for when we do parables, they have one message. Number two, Jesus primarily used parables to teach the disciples. We'll find today an example of where he's using parables at a chance to get to the religious leaders, but primarily he uses them to teach his disciples. There's a bigger picture, and in both sets of these, and we were talking about how oftentimes the parables that are most known to us, we learned in the third grade at Bible school, and we have a third grade understanding of them. The ones that we look at today usually aren't taught to our children. So
Mary was asking, what's the third grade lesson on these? And I said, no, we don't teach these to third graders.
And then finally, it's always important to look at the cultural setting of what the people knew when Jesus was teaching these, what was the understanding, and who Jesus was talking to. The other thing is, I was asking Scott today, these two sets of parables that we're looking at today both of them are in 3 of the 4 gospels. And some of the ones we look at are in just one gospel. Some of them are in 2, but both of these are in 3. So I was asking Scott, what's the deal with that?
Yeah, John went his own way. The 3 are called synoptic. That means they look alike. But Luke came along. He wasn't one of them. He wasn't there from the beginning. So he went back after the fact and asked around. He interviewed people. Luke was methodical. He was a physician. And so he wound up, most of the ones that are only in one gospel are in Luke, because he brought stories from people that, the other ones wrote what they remembered. And I think if they were carbon copies of each other, I'd be skeptical, because that's what the police always say. If there's, I know that from TV, actually. I don't know if that's true, but on TV, the police always say if the stories are identical, it's because they're rehearsed. And you see, whether it's discrepancy or not, what one person decided was important, what was on their heart, wasn't always the same as the other ones. But Luke has the most that are just in one gospel.
And on these, sometimes the words are almost exactly the same in Matthew and Mark, and then Luke might add something different.
That's true.
And Luke wrote his gospel later than Matthew and Mark?
I think that's right.
Okay. So the first ones we're going to look at 2 sets today. And the first one is called patching garments, or like I said last time, these ones seem to have multiple names, or old wineskins. So, and Scott, I am going to have you look at,
excuse me, Mary, where are you?
We are going to be in Luke chapter 5. Mm-hmm. And so this is in Matthew in chapter 9, and in Mark chapter 2. But we're going to read it out of Luke chapter 5. And I said that the parable of the wineskins and the patching garments starts in verse 36. But as usual, we have to go back a ways to
see what was going on at the time.
Yes.
You want me to read it?
Yes, I'm just a second. I'm letting 2 other people in.
Okay,
go ahead. Yes, read it.
So I'm going to start back at verse 27. This is Luke 5. After this, we're just going to have to ignore the after this. After this, Jesus went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting in a tax booth. "Follow me," he told him. And Levi got up and left everything and followed him. And this is Luke. This is, typical Luke. This is a detail that is really kind of important. I mentioned last week, I'm sure you've heard other places about how these tax collectors were reviled. I mean, they were just, it's not too strong to say hated. And so the good people a lot of the time were ignoring Jesus. And he goes to this tax collector, this, bad guy. And he says, follow me. And the guy did. Now, he would have known who Jesus was, but he got a call and he just packed up and went to follow him. And it's significant. That's Luke. And it says Levi hosted a great banquet for Jesus at his house. Remember, I said last week these tax collectors had more money than commoners because a lot of the time they cheated the system. But after he follows him, he throws a banquet, and a large crowd of tax collectors were there, along with others who were eating with them. The bad people. But the Pharisees and their scribes complained to Jesus' disciples, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" Now, and what you see, Jesus answered. So what they're doing is they're just outside the sort of the gate, the courtyard, and they're talking in these loud terms. You've seen people do it. They act like I'm talking to this person and I'm really announcing it. And Jesus answered, which means he had heard. And he says, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. This is pretty typical of his ministry, and it's pretty typical of the Pharisees. But that sort of sets the context for how these people are behaving, what the Pharisees are up to. Then they said to him, and that's these Pharisees, John's disciples and those of the Pharisees frequently fast and pray, but yours keep on eating and drinking. And before we move on from that, first of all, I talked last week or the first week about discipleship. And you notice the Pharisees have disciples. John the baptizer, John the Baptist, had disciples. And somehow a lot of people have this idea that these disciples that Jesus had, this is some odd thing. It's not. These are people who agreed to follow the teachings of the Pharisees, or people who agreed to follow the teachings of John the Baptist. And so the first thing you see is they have disciples, and they say that their disciples fast all the time. They fast a lot. It was common practice for the Pharisees to fast 2 days a week. And they say, we fast, how come you don't? And so to really get the most out of this, first thing you've got to understand is these are the keepers of the law. Well, the law only tells the Jews to fast 1 day a year. The Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, they're told to fast. All of this other stuff has built up as a tradition, as we find in other places. Jesus says they, in fact, at the end of this chapter, I think is where he says it, but he tells them, if you're going to fast, keep it to yourself. Don't go around making frowny faces, telling people how much suffering you're going through for God's benefit. If fasting would be a thing that people did when they have a problem, when there's some big concern, when they need an answer, and they would do this to take away everything except this focus on speaking with God. And they've turned it into something else. So what they're doing is they're coming around griping. Hey, how come we have to fast and you don't? And the first and most obvious answer is you don't have to. Nobody's making you do this. You've turned it into law, and it's not. The law says 1 day. But anyway, Jesus' response is, can you make the guests of the bridegroom fast while he's with them? But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, then they will fast. So he's saying you people are supposed to be fasting because you have some problem, because there's some huge concern and you're trying to draw closer to God. And he's saying the bridegroom is obviously him.
I'm here.
They don't have a problem. If they need an answer, they can ask me. The bridegroom is with them. right now they have no cause to fast, and it's not the law. Later on, after I'm gone, they'll have plenty of time for this. So once again, we've got this context. And then it says that Jesus, this is where the parable begins. He also told them a parable. No one tears a piece of cloth from a new garment and sews it on an old one. If he does, he will tear the new garment. It will tear the new garment as well, and the patch from the new one will not match the old. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the new wine will burst the skins, the wine will spill, and the wineskins will be ruined. Instead, new wine is poured into new wineskins, and no one, after drinking old wine, wants new, for he says the old is better.
So first of all, like I said, in Matthew and Mark, they're almost identical. One of the differences, and we'll discuss it, is that last sentence is added just in Luke. And that's important. So who is he talking to? He's talking to the disciples in this one.
It looks like he's talking to the Pharisees.
But he's talking to the disciples.
And so this is the one I told you. I told you before that a lot of the time Jesus is pointed this way, but he's teaching this way. Okay? This is a message being spoken to the Pharisees, but it's not their message. It's a message for the disciples.
And, just most will know, but the whole idea of the wineskins, how culturally, what was the wineskins? They were grape.
Yeah, that part is just mechanical.
Yeah.
People today make wine in bottles with a balloon on the top, and the fermentation causes this expansion of gases. The wine doesn't expand. The gases expand though, but it blows the balloon up. And then when the fermentation begins to slow down, when the balloon has collapsed, the wine is ready. Well, if you do that in a sealed wineskin, and you can't leave it open, because if you leave it open, bacteria gets in and it goes bad. So you've got to seal it. And the first time you do that, the skin is capable of stretching. And then after that, it's stretched all it can. And if you try and do it again, it'll do just what they said. It'll fill up and burst the wineskins and ruin the whole thing. So,
but what does he mean now? Yeah, go ahead. Now the tough part.
All right. And so I know you guys probably get tired of hearing us say this, but we probably listened to a dozen sermons and commentaries, and it's just, stuff is all over the place. The first thing is, the reason I'm telling you it's a message for the disciples, because if you look at this, what he's doing, these Pharisees have come and said, how come you don't fast? We're sort of bitter about this. We're miserable people because of this. And how come your people get by without fasting? And they're legalistic. They have taken a thing that's entirely optional and they've made it law. And so what he's telling the disciples is, for later reference, you're not going to change these people, and you're not going to change this system. It can't contain the message. It can't exist without the legalism, because that's become everything that it is.
So the old garments or the old wineskins is following the law. Is that system?
That's right. That's right.
And the new wine is Jesus's teaching. And the hard part is how do you combine the two? And he's saying you don't.
You don't. There's going to be a time, as I've been saying, that's what comes into a lot of these. There's going to be a time where he's crucified, he's resurrected and gone, and they're the ones responsible for building the body, the church, the global church. And one of the things, there's always a temptation to say, well, we need to fix what's wrong with the system. We just need to put a patch on it. And that's where that first example about the patch, you take an old garment and it's got a hole, and they didn't have Walmart, and you put a patch of new cloth that's already, that's not stretched, and it's going to pull when it's washed, and it's going to tear away the cloth, and you're still going to have a hole. And if you understand that he's talking directly about what's going on. These people who have taken this fasting, put yourself in the position of these disciples. They're attacking the disciples, not Jesus himself. How come your disciples don't fast? If these people come after you, they can harm you. I mean, you could get for violating these religious tenets, you could get put in jail. He's talking to them. And he said, these people are not going to change. They cannot contain, this system cannot contain what I'm telling you. And later on, when the time comes, don't be tempted to think you're going to reform what's there. It'll stretch. If they did change, it would tear apart everything they are. They'd no longer be who they are. First, it's not going to happen. And second of all, it doesn't make sense. You're going to have to start with something new. And so it's the same example on the wineskins. He just gives them two. They're rigid. And if you try to do that, if they were to convert, it would destroy what they are. It's not going to happen. So this is one of those examples. Even though it seems like we've seen that he's still talking to them, he's really educating back over his shoulder at the 12.
The last sentence of Luke's version of this parable seems to mess people up.
Oh, it just tears people up.
And it is, again.
Mary's got a good point. This line is only in Luke, but he says, no one after drinking old wine wants new, for he says the old is better. And to a lot of people, that sounds like what Jesus is saying, is that the old way, what the Pharisees are doing, is really better. It's old wine. It's fine wine. We wouldn't want to mess with that. And so you hear all kinds of things, but it's pretty clear from the context. If you understand what he's teaching them, that you're not going to reform the old church, then he's saying anyone who's steeped in the law, anyone who has enjoyed this power that it gives them, and the acknowledgement, the kudos that it gives them, they're not going to change. They're not going to say, oh, what a fool I've been. Let me give all this up. They're going to look at it and say, no, the old wine is better. The old way of doing things is much better than what you're saying. If we give up the law, how will we control people? Who will we be if we don't have this structure giving us authority, and they can't let go? So, I mean, that statement, I don't think in context could be a whole lot clearer. If they're steeped in the law, if they're part of the system, their response is going to be, hey, the old ways are better.
Well, if you go on,
Isaiah?
No, oh yeah, Isaiah first, yeah.
I'm going to throw in a little something extra because this idea of fasting.
Tell her where you are.
I'm in Isaiah. Hopefully, here it is. Isaiah 58, and I'll give you a moment. So I'm going to start at verse 1, but this is about the fasting. And this is just a little reinforcement for the idea that fasting is not part of the Mosaic law, except Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, yeah. But Isaiah is so cool. And God tells him, go tell my people this.
I wonder a lot of people would describe Isaiah as cool.
Well, yeah, I think having the courage to stand up and say, thus saith the Lord, you got to be pretty bold to do that. Isaiah 58, starting with 1. And he says, cry aloud, do not hold back. Raise your voice like a ram's horn. Declare my people their transgression. This is God speaking to him. For day after day, they seek me. This is God talking about his people. Day after day, they seek me and delight in my ways like a nation. So it's these people who are saying they're looking for God. They're trying to do the right thing. And going down to verse 3, This is supposed to be a quote of the people. Why have we fasted and you have not seen? We have humbled ourselves and you have not noticed. So even back then, there are people saying they're fasting to get God to do what they want. It's not to draw closer to him. It's not to seek him. It's because they want him to do something for them. And they say, look, we fasted and you didn't jump. You didn't do what we told you. How come? And God's response is, behold, on the day of your fast, you do as you please, and you oppress all your workers. You fast with contention and strife, to strike viciously with your fist. You cannot fast as you do today and have your voice be heard on high. This is the Pharisees. I don't know how long it is, 1,500 years? No, not 1,500, 1,000. Anyway, they fast, but they do it with an attitude. It's about this, it's about something other than what it's supposed to be. And then comes verse 5. This is God speaking to his people through Isaiah. And he says, is this the fast I have chosen? A day for a man to deny himself, how to bow his head like a reed, and to spread out sackcloth and ashes? Will you call this a fast and a day acceptable to the Lord? See, he's saying this, I didn't prescribe this. I didn't tell you to do this. And we go to verse 6, and he says, isn't this the fast I have chosen? To break the chains of wickedness, to untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free, and tear off every yoke? Isn't it to share your bread with the hungry, to bring the poor and homeless into your home, to clothe the naked when you see them, and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood? Then your light will break forth like the dawn. Your healing will come quickly. Your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. And so this is this notice through Isaiah. These people are fasting, and they're doing all the wrong things. They oppress their workers. They aren't taking care. And this message to them is, no, I'm not listening to you. No, this fast is not something special to me. This is the fast I have chosen, that you'd feed the poor, that you'd clothe people who need clothing, that you'd take the homeless in, that you'd feed people who are hungry. That's the fast. Then I'll listen to you. There's the Pharisees. This is exactly what they're doing. And that's when, if you put that into, again, context, there's no reason for Jesus to be trying to tell the Pharisees that, because they aren't going to listen. He knows they're not going to listen. That's part of the message, that they're not going to listen. So who else is he talking to?
So this was a problem 1,000 years before Jesus. And then this was preached by Jesus, and in Acts, when Jesus is died, risen from the dead, and ascended into heaven, the early churches started, and Peter still gets to deal with this. You want to talk a little bit about Peter dealing with it?
Peter starts out in Jerusalem, and they set up sort of now it's Christian power structure centered in Jerusalem, and they're virtually all Jews. And they begin to set up their own little legalistic system. And Peter gets pulled into it. And so what Peter's trying to do is to reform, and that whole group, they're trying to reform the system of Judaism, the legal system, and to take it and use it as a base. But then we're going to do certain things a little bit different. And Peter got caught up in it, and they wound up, he and Paul got into a kind of a row over it. But the point is, they'd all been told, you're not going to reform. You're not going to change it. You're going to start with a new wineskin. You're not going to be able to put a patch on the old garment. You're going to start with a new wineskin, and it's the only way this is going to work. So it took a while even for them to get the message maybe as fully as they should.
Well, and I think my point of view, bringing that back up again, was this is an issue as humans that we dealt with before. It wasn't new when Jesus was telling the disciples about what the Pharisees were doing. It wasn't new even when Peter just heard it, he fell back into it, and it's probably not new for us.
It didn't go away.
It didn't.
I don't know what else to say. I mean, I know that's, I don't want to step on too many toes, but it didn't go away. And so a lot of churches have created their own man-made legal system. You go back to the law, you try and find it, it's not there. But they create their own traditions that say you must do this way. And who else's law could that be? If it's not God's law, then whose is it? And I think a lot of damage gets done that way. But same message, down the road, same thing.
The second set of parables that we're going to look at today, it's either called the vicious vine keepers or the parable of the tenants. Like I said, they give these things names and you try to look for them and then you realize they're in different names in different places. And this parable is found in Matthew 21, verses 33 through 46, and in Mark 12, 1 through 12. And then I apologize, we're going to read it in Luke, and the list I was using had it incorrectly written as Luke 21. It's actually Luke 20, verses 9 to 19. And this one is a little different in the fact he is not speaking, he is speaking to the religious leaders and he's looking at them and speaking to them. Not that the disciples wouldn't hear this, but this message is primarily for them. And I guess, Scott, you walked away from us, but I guess one of the questions here is that we often hear that parables are only, that they're a hidden message, before I read this, a hidden message and only to those who can have an open heart. And this is an example of not.
That is one of the fairly common stories that we hear. And as we've studied, we hear it a lot, that what he was trying to do was to keep his message hidden to buy time so he wouldn't make them angry and they wouldn't kill him. And so the reason I wanted to cover this one today is this sort of refutes that directly. There are others that do, but he's doing just the exact opposite, and it tells us so.
So where is this taking place? This is taking place probably the week that Jesus was crucified. He is already in Jerusalem, and he's speaking in the open area right in front of the temple. One day as Jesus was teaching, the people in the temple One day as Jesus was teaching the people in the temple courts and proclaiming the gospel, the chief priests and scribes, together with the elders, came up to him. "Tell us," they said, "by what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority?" "I will also ask you a question," Jesus replied. "Tell me, John the baptism, was it from heaven or from men?" They deliberated among themselves and said, "If we say from heaven, he will ask, 'Why did you not believe him?' But if we say from men, all the people will stone us, for they are convinced that John was a prophet." So they answered that they did not know where it was from. And Jesus replied, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things." Then he proceeded to tell the people this parable. "A man planted a vineyard, rented it out to some tenants, and went away for a long time. At harvest time, he sent a servant to the tenants to collect his share of the fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants beat the servant and sent him away empty-handed. So he sent another servant, but they beat him and treated him shamefully, sending him away empty-handed. Then he sent a third, but they wounded him and threw him out. 'What shall I do?' asked the owner of the vineyard. 'I will send my beloved son. Perhaps they will respect him.' But when the tenants saw the son, They discussed it among themselves and said, "This is the heir. Let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and kill those tenants and will give the vineyard to others. And when the people heard this, they said, "May such a thing never happen." But Jesus looked directly at them and said, "Then what is the meaning of that which is written? The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on the stone will be broken to pieces, but he on whom it falls will be crushed." When the scribes and chief priests realized that Jesus had spoken this parable against them, they sought to arrest him that very hour, but they were afraid of the people.
So clearly not a hidden message. You skip to the end, and when he's done with these really two things, but only the second one's a parable, but when he's done speaking, the leadership, the Pharisees, the scribes, that bunch, immediately began looking for a way that they can kill him. They said, "We've got to do something about him, and we've got to do something about him now, because he's stirring up the people against us. It will eventually threaten our power if we let this keep going." So he did not teach a message that was hidden.
So some of the basics, first of all, the tenants were the people of Israel. The servants were the Old Testament prophets all the way up to John the Baptist. And the son was Jesus. And the owner was God. So those are some of the basics. Go ahead.
I was going to back up where the first thing that we read that really wasn't the parable, but the setting, they're demanding to know what authority, by whose authority are you doing all this stuff? What they're really wanting to do is to insinuate and eventually to say outright that you're doing this through the power of Satan, through evil, and then they can get him for blasphemy and they can have him killed. And they ask him this blunt question, by whose authority? And it's a thing where they're trying to trap him into saying, I'm doing this under the authority of God. And so he says, I'll answer your question, but first answer me one. John the Baptist, did his baptizing come from God, or was it a thing of man? And so he traps them instead. I know he's God, because the wisdom of these things that he does. He says, you tell me, was it from God or was it from man? And they confer among themselves. They huddle up. And it says that they came back and said, we don't know. The point is, they know they're trapped. If they say it's from God, then they're in trouble because they denied it. And if they say it's from man, the people are going to be upset. So he trapped them with this question. And they said, we're not going to tell you. You know, they've come up with something because they conferred, they huddled up, and they said, we're not going to tell you. And he said, well, then I'm not going to tell you by whose authority. That's fair enough. We'll both agree to just, not answer the question. And then he tells this parable. And as Mary said, Jerusalem, and they're sitting right outside Jerusalem.
Oh, they're in
Jerusalem.
They're in Jerusalem.
There are other places in Scripture, Old Testament on up, where Jerusalem is known for killing prophets. Over the centuries, God has sent prophets, and they have mistreated them, they have beaten them, they have killed them. And they're known for it. And it's not, just take my word, well, another time. But he talks about this vineyard owner who leaves these people in charge. And when it's time for him to get his due, they mistreat and abuse and wound and eventually kill the servants that he sends. And it's not lost on anyone. That's the prophets. God is the vineyard owner. He's left these people in charge. And then he sent servants, and this is how they've been done. So he says, I'm going to send my beloved son. And you see from the response, there's no doubt in anyone's mind what he's saying. That's sort of the point. You can tell from the response that everyone knows he's talking about himself.
And so an aside on this, you always say there are people that believe that Jesus did not even think he was.
That's a good point. It's a very good point. There are people, it's a very popular thing right now for people to say that no one believed that Jesus was divine. No one believed that Jesus was God's son until the Council of Nicaea, a few hundred years later. And they even say Jesus himself didn't believe it. But he tells these stories. He's identifying himself as the Son of God. There's, another place where he says, I tell you this, even before Abraham was born, I am. And that I am is the same exact phrasing that God used to tell Moses. What happens when Pharaoh asks who this God is? You just tell him, I am. And so, this idea that he didn't believe it, nobody believed it until the Council of Nicaea, I don't know, you just have to put blinders on.
So he was saying, I am the Son of God, and the Pharisees or the religious leaders knew that that's what he was saying. There was no question about it.
And so we get to that he says what's the vineyard owner going to do after they've done this? He says, well, I'll tell you what's going to happen. He's going to come, he's going to kill those people, and he's going to put somebody else in charge. He's going to give what they've been put in charge of, he's going to take it away from them, and he's going to give it to someone else. And again, there's no doubt that's what we're told. That's what we've seen, is that the authority, in fact, in 30, we were just listening to this, but it's true, 30 years, 35 years from the time this happened, Jerusalem is brought down, the temple is leveled, no two stones are left upon each other, and their entire system is destroyed. Less than 30 years. He takes it away from them, the church is established, and that authority is given to them. You want anything else you want to get to?
No. How about everyone who falls on the stone will be broken to pieces?
And that's, again, a clear reference. The stone that the builder has rejected.
I think it's Psalm 118.
Psalm 118. And as, we talked yesterday, and what Mary said is, we just did the Psalm, so, recently. So that's pretty cool. 118 was prophetic. It was messianic. And even back then, it was recognized that David is talking about the coming Messiah. So it's not like after the fact they look at it and they said, oh, hey, that sounds like this other thing. That must have been prophetic. Even then, that was known to be and considered a prophetic psalm. And he talks about the stone that the builder rejected has become the cornerstone, the centerpiece, the piece that holds everything else together. And he says to them, when he tells this parable, that he's obviously saying he's going to be killed. But he says, haven't you ever heard the stone that the builder rejected? That's me. You're rejecting me. You're going to reject me, and I will become the cornerstone. It is bold. It is, for them, it's out in the open. I know we may struggle with it because we're not from that, but it is so bold, no one can miss it. And you can tell that, again, by the response, because it says they began to plot among themselves, they have to do something with him immediately, because it says they perceived that he had spoken this parable against them. Unmistakable words.
The other thing that one of the sermons we listened to on this that I thought brought out an interesting point, going back basically to the first thing, it says, one day as Jesus was teaching, no, wait a minute, let me see. I'm sorry, back to 9.
Verse 9.
A man planted a vineyard, rented it out to some tenants, and went away for a long time. At harvest time, he sent a servant to the tenants to collect his share of the fruit of the vineyard. The whole idea of fruit.
Go ahead.
Anyhow, we are listening to a sermon that says that, God is a fruit hunter. Was that
fruit inspector?
A fruit inspector. And the idea that as believers, he's looking for us to bear fruit. And sometimes as people, we decide it's our job to decide if someone else, another believer, is bearing fruit. And we heard an example of, someone says, oh, I have salvation now, I've turned my life around. And we sit there and think, well, they certainly aren't doing much with it, or they're not acting like it.
You do that.
that first of all, that's not ours to judge, but that God is looking for people to be fruitful with their belief. Is that the best way to say it?
Yeah, and that analogy of fruit comes up a lot. We listen to, but there's another place where there's a fig tree. It should, by that time, it's got leaves, it should have figs, and there are none. There's the promise, and it's bearing no fruit. And he says, you'll not bear fruit again, and it withers up and dies. And this is one of those things, it's not technically a parable, but it says that the disciples were amazed that this thing would just dry up and die. And he tells them, don't be amazed. You're going to do the same sorts of things. You're going to be able to say the same sorts of things. And it's not until you realize just what I said a while ago, 30 years later, that fruit tree was an analogy for Israel, for the nation. And you've promised fruit, you've had every opportunity, and you haven't brought forth. And he said, your time is over. You're going to, and not long after he dies, the nation, as a nation, is gone. It withers up and dies. And it's not totally a stretch to talk about how these disciples made some pronouncements to that effect.
And why this is important. So I said this parable is in 3 of the 4 Gospels, and it's some almost word for word. Luke, as I said, added that last sentence, but what comes right before it is different. And I believe it's in Matthew. If you read Matthew's version, right before Matthew's version is this story about Jesus and the fig tree. So he emphasizes the fruit aspect of this parable more in Matthew.
It's all related. It really is. And you begin to see this consistency in the stories and in the parables and the deeds, the teachings. You begin to see this tremendous consistency. So one last thing that I know we're almost out of time, but there's a point not long before this happened. And in one of our other studies, we talked about it, but Jesus, the time comes and he begins to head south towards Jerusalem. And along the way, he angers Herod. His followers, the spies, send back word. The whole way down, when I said at the beginning of this, he really had 2 missions. He's teaching the disciples, the 12, readying them, but he's hurtling headlong towards Jerusalem and the cross. And so he insults these people all the way down. They're already fired up. But you remember that he's come into Jerusalem on what we call Palm Sunday. They greet him like a king or a prince. The people are excited, and he does this and virtually goads them. I mean, they would kill him right now if they could. He's pronounced himself to be the Son of God, and he has openly in front of all these people challenged their authority, challenged their goodness, you know, painted them to be these evil vineyard keepers, and said that eventually God will take the vineyard away from them and give it to someone else. He's assured that they're going to kill him. He's gone out of his way to make this happen. And that's how, in a matter of days, we go from him being greeted like a king. And you see, they're afraid of the people, so they do what politicians do, and they find a way around it. But he made sure of it. And that's what this parable really is.
There was one sermon that talked about that there are people that try to figure out like what day what this was, which I know is sort of ridiculous. But if you look at Palm Sunday, they believe that this was like Tuesday. Palm Sunday was on Sunday, obviously. This was Tuesday, and then Jesus was killed on Friday.
Within days. He enraged them so much that they pieced together these charges and how they were going to go about it in a matter of days. They were hot.
Next week, we are going to study parables that have that say something about forgiveness and judgment. And we're going to do forgiving the 5,000 and the 500. And you don't have to write this down while you want to. Luke 7:41, and the forgiven who wouldn't forgive, Matthew 18 verses 23 and 25. And then the one on judgment, separating the sheep from the goats, Matthew 25:31 to 46. So the three ones that we're going to look at next week are each only seen in one gospel.
Luke. I love Luke.
Luke, and then two Matthews.
All right. So we will send out the list earlier in the week this time. It slipped. I don't know what to tell you.
I slipped.
We'll reinforce those. But anyway, it's got to do with forgiveness. The first two do. I almost feel like somebody else ought to teach that, because that's hard. I don't know about you, but that's hard. So that's it.
That's it.
God, we look at the message that you give. We look at these parables. We see the teaching for the disciples, and we know that it's supposed to be teaching for us as well. We share the same responsibilities. We've been handed down the responsibility to take care of the things that they were responsible for. And sometimes we fall short. Sometimes we fail to look. We don't always look and say, that means us too. So we're grateful for the words. We're grateful for the teachings that remind us of that. Help us to be the new wineskins and not the old. Help us to accept the new teaching and not cling to the legalism that infects us, that makes us feel important. Help us to remember, like Isaiah said, that the fast that you want from us is to feed the hungry, to take care of people, to send that same grace that you bestow on us to others. Be with us this week as always. We go out to do your work. Amen.
You guys can unmute yourself. And thank you guys for patience if you get offline, I do end up seeing you. I'm sorry it took me a while, Susan, to get you back on, but I appreciate the best way is to text me, and I eventually see that beeping and I do it. So I apologize if it took a little while.
That's okay. Thank you so much. We're a little unstable here internet-wise, so.
Yeah.
What can we say?
There you go. Well, you guys all stay warm, and Susan,
good to see you.
Stay cool.
Not a problem.
Happy Valentine's Day, everybody.
Happy Valentine's Day, everybody.
Happy Valentine's Day.
Bye-bye.
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 Bye.
Jeffrey Rose glasses.